So you've rolled initiative and battle is about to begin, but you don't want to be the player who makes the costly mistake that causes a TPK.
My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. And today we're going to discuss 10 frustrating mistakes that D&D players make in the midst of combat. Less so rules mistakes. These are tactical errors that sometimes might cost your party hit points or even their lives. And you don't want to make them.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling. As a little disclaimer as we get into this episode, Monty and I have made every single one of these mistakes. And if you watch our Dungeons of Drakenheim campaign, you can watch me specifically make all of these mistakes in real time.
For that reason, don't beat yourself up if you've made these mistakes or give each other a hard time about making them. It's one thing to give someone a tip of being like, hey, in the next battle, brush things up a little bit, but don't be a jerk to your fellow friends and party members if they're making these mistakes. Because, of course, the first mistake that many players make in D&D is just not working together effectively as a team. And supporting one another with constructive feedback is a good way to support your team, engage in that communication, and engage in that teamwork.
Communication might not be something that can happen at the table during combat. You might not be able to yell out, hey, you should use a fireball on your next turn, depending on how forgiving your DM is. Knowing your characters, and not only your character, but the character that everybody else is bringing to the table, what the strengths and weaknesses of the party are, being able to communicate that amongst yourselves and know what your go-to strategies are, is really going to solve every other problem that we are going to talk about in this episode. As we go down the list, if you've communicated your ideas, know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and are executing planned tactical maneuvers in battle, you're probably not going to run into the other problems.
It's very common for D&D groups to spend a ton of time overthinking and planning every move that they possibly make. And so these are conversations that can often happen offline or between sessions or between players when you talk about your favorite spells, abilities, and other class features and possible different ways that you could use them together or work together in play. Think about what you can do as a character, think about what you like to do and what the other party members can do, and have those conversations. And as long as you are talking to one another about what you all want to do in general in battle and thinking about, hey, I'm not playing a solo game, I'm playing a team game, we're all in this together. There's things that I can rely on my party members for, and there's things that I have to contribute as well. And putting that in the context of a conversation, that's how you build the groundwork for a great team.
So with that as the major overlapping rule for all the rest of these, let's move on to the list of all the other mistakes that players make. The second mistake that a lot of players make when they're trying to do tactical combat in D&D is not focusing fire. Oftentimes, and you can see this in our games a lot, one player will attack one enemy, the next player will attack a different enemy, the third player will attack an even different enemy, and all of a sudden you have little bits of damage all over the board, which is good. Doing damage to enemies is great, but it's better if you kill an enemy. If you take an enemy off the battlefield, they can't do damage to you anymore.
Imagine it like this. Let's say that you're fighting a gang of 4 ogres. Each ogre has about 60 hit points. And let's say that on average, your party members can each do 15 points of damage. Well, that means that if all your party members, assuming 4 versus 4, if all you attack the same ogre, it's very likely that that ogre is going to get taken out in one round, which means it now isn't going to be able to do damage over subsequent turns to your party. Ogres hit pretty hard. They do about 15 damage in return. So if you imagine that same party attacked a different ogre instead, all the ogres survive for 4 rounds of combat, which means all of them are getting to do damage. Whereas if one ogre gets taken out on the first round, another on the second, another on the third, and another on the fourth, there's less damage that comes into the party overall. Now, this makes sense for just a simple battle against a group of ogres, but it applies to so many other different things. Against enemy spellcasters, against dragons, against hydras. Whenever you're fighting a group of enemies, Making sure that all of your damage is generally being focused on one single target at a time is going to mean that you're going to have to spend less resources healing yourselves after that battle is over. Now, area of effect damage spells can always be part of your strategy. We're not saying that, oh, you should disintegrate one target instead of fireballing a bunch of targets. Sometimes that's the better move. And if your entire party has AoE abilities and you can carpet bomb the field effectively, that can be a worthwhile strategy. But as a general principle, choose one target and everybody should focus on them together until that target's killed.
Keep in mind that different combat encounters might require different things. Focusing fire isn't the only tactic to take. Sometimes it is valuable for one person to be in charge of cleaning up the minions while the other 3 people focus fire on a single target. Sometimes there's something that needs to be performed on the battlefield, switches that need to be pulled, something that needs to be activated, an item that needs to be obtained. Having one person doing the other job while the other people focus fire is just as important. So this isn't a ignore the other tactical options available to you to focus fire on a single enemy. There's a lot of ways that there's nuance to this rule, but generally speaking, what you don't want to do is have all of your party members attacking different people for no reason when you could have taken one off of the board.
This leads us into our next point, which is paired with focusing fire, and this is called target prioritization. What this means is that even though all your allies are all attacking the same thing or have identified the same target, sometimes if you've got multiple different enemies that you're facing, choosing which one is the one that should go down and which your party members need to focus on in general can be a challenge for many groups. Knowing what the biggest threat or the most important thing you need to deal with on each round of combat is something that takes time to assess. Do you go for the scary looking wizard that is charging up a powerful spell, or the very, very terrifying armored fire giant that is barreling down towards your party? If you're fighting both of those things at the same time, that's a difficult decision that you're going to have to make based on your party's abilities, based on the rest of the environment, based on everything that's going on. But deciding which one to focus on is an important thing. And I think that it's often this split of target prioritization that results in that split fire. Some of the players in your group think the spellcaster is more important, but some of the players in your group think that the big giant is more important. Choose as a whole, take one of them out, but assess what's the bigger threat from moment to moment. As Kelly said, sometimes it's worthwhile having someone deal with a separate problem while the rest of the group assesses that together. But this is all part of the art of target prioritization.
I personally find that this is where our group falls apart, and I think it's a lack of communication. And again, sometimes, especially if you're really deep in the role playing and you don't have a lot of out of character chatter at your table, when we're doing our stream, we try to avoid out of character chatter. So I can't often have a conversation once initiative is rolled saying, hey guys, I think we should take the spellcaster out first. That's kind of metagaming. So at our table, we try to avoid that, which means that when I think in my head, oh, we should definitely be taking the spellcaster out first, and I'm going last in initiative, and the other 2 people I'm playing with go after different targets, and then I say, well, I know that spellcaster is going to be the biggest problem, so I'm going after it. But now we're not focusing fire, and we both have different ideas on what the target priority is.
This is why it's important to communicate, and it is okay to have a short tactical discussion or to say something between your player characters in combat. I will say that as a DM, in the middle of combat, if the player characters are barking commands at one another, I assume that those are happening to some degree in the narrative, so the enemies can hear the players making this conversation, which is a big benefit to having telepathy, if you've got access to that. So I'm okay with players having tactical conversations in the midst of battle. I don't consider it metagaming. I just consider it happening in universe. And so if your player shouts out, kill the mage, then the mage is going to know that you're coming for them.
And that is fair. I think that, like, it depends on the type of discussion that's happening at the table. I do think that when we are talking about target priority, Some of the keys are, is there a spellcaster, especially if they're concentrating on a spell?
Yeah.
And if there isn't one of those, then is there an enemy who is performing a task? Again, maybe if there is an ulterior motive to the combat encounter. Maybe there's a MacGuffin that you need to get. Maybe there's switches that need to be pulled. What's the enemy that's preventing you from accomplishing your goal? And then lastly, what's the enemy that's doing the most damage? That's kind of my list of priorities. Concentration on a spell, stopping you from achieving your goal, or doing the most damage.
Yeah, and then counterpoint, you can also identify low priority targets as well. For example, if you have a wizard or a sorcerer or a warlock in your party that has powerful battlefield control effects, then you might lower the prioritization of enemies that have weak saving throws because you know, hey, the warlock's going to enrapture them with hypnotic pattern, or the cleric is going to banish that demon, so we're not going to make that a priority because we know that we have the battlefield control to put that enemy to the side while we focus on another foe. So it is a back and forth. There is an art to it. There's a lot of nuance, but assessing what are the enemies that you're going to be focusing on damaging, what are the enemies that you're going to try to control on the battlefield, and what are the enemies that you gotta take out. That's the magic, and that's why the communication is needed.
One mistake that can happen that has been a thorn in my side as the primary spellcaster in one of our groups is spoiling AoE positioning. I can't tell you the number of times that I have to silently let out a sad little sigh as I look at my spells, see a group of enemies huddled together, ponder how I'm going to destroy them all as soon as my turn comes up, only to have my other two teammates run in, mess up the positioning of everybody, or draw enemies towards them, or blast them out of range, or just move the battlefield in a way that now I have to completely reassess what I was going to do on my turn. I think that it's a problem with all spellcasters that what you think you're going to do on your turn and what you end up doing on your turn are wildly different just based on how everybody takes their turn. But as a team, if you know your wizard or sorcerer's turn is coming up and there's a group of enemies all huddled together and you're the fighter and the paladin and the monk, instead of grabbing those enemies or drawing them away or running into the middle of it, if you can instead spend your turns knocking them closer together or grouping enemies together, which there's a lot of abilities to do that, try to help the AoE setup rather than diminish from it.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be the simplest thing. I can't tell you how many times as a player where I've gone like, just move one square back. If you were just one square back, I could do X, Y, and Z, but you moved one little bit too forward. And I actually had an instance where a friend of mine they ran their fighter in, they got surrounded and set themselves up to be surrounded, and they took a ton of damage. And I was like, I can bail you out, but the only thing I've got is going to be like a fireball. And they said, well, just do it anyways. And this is a very valid thing about the AoE positioning, is maybe the tiefling paladin doesn't care about getting fireballed.
I think this also has to do with communication, is if you are the spellcaster, check in with your meat shields and ask them if they are okay being fireballed. Not all the time.
Yeah.
But if I'm a raging barbarian and we're at pretty decent levels, there's a good chance I have over 100 hit points. And I take half damage on most things anyway. So if I'm running into battle as the barbarian and there are 20 little minions surrounding me, please fireball them.
Or the character that has immunity to charm or fear doesn't care if you put a hypnotic pattern down on the middle of them.
Yeah.
Right? So sometimes character abilities can come into play here and enable you to do tricky things. And of course, if you're an evocation wizard or you're a sorcerer that has the ability to sculpt their spells and in some way, then maybe you're fine. Like, these abilities are great for that reason. But being considerate of that positioning is really, really key. And I think that so often I have actually killed a party member with my AoE, because they ran in, were surrounded. I said, I could AoE these guys. I can get everybody. And they were like, do it. And then they died.
I did.
Like,
I was the DM at a table that had a barbarian in it, and he always ran into battle. But I remember the day that the spellcasters in the group were like, what do I do? He's always running into battle. And finally there was a day that he looked at the rest of the party. He's like, you guys can always fireball me. Just as a blanket statement, you can always drop your AoE with me in there. And then everybody did, and they won most battles because he couldn't go down barely ever. He almost did a few times. And they just created a whirlwind of devastation with that.
That said, the cleric is often not too happy about the extra healing spells they have to expend on the barbarian regardless. So be conscious of that. And I think that this leads us well into the next mistake, though, which is being overly conservative with your resources in general. I've played with many players who they might often use that AoE positioning as an excuse not to use their spell, and then they just default to a cantrip. Unless the cantrip is the winning move, you should be... Cantrips are for mop-up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If you're a spellcaster and you're going down to your cantrips, it means that you probably could be doing a little bit more. Sometimes again, it is the play, but I see a lot of players that they save all their spells for the final encounter, and then they didn't use them because they ended the day with most of their high-level spell slots still available. Your spells are there to be used, and being overly conservative with them means that someone else in your party has to spend those resources instead of you, whether that's in the form of their spell slots and their limited use abilities, or in the form of hit points from the extra damage that they took because the enemies weren't dealt with in a timely fashion.
I think that it's really important that it's known that if you're not outputting enough in the combat encounter, then the other people are going to have to output more. And spell slots are there to be used, abilities are there to be used, and I think it's important to know who your priority targets are, focusing fire, all of the things that we've mentioned already. But I feel way cooler when I am blowing my spell slots to do epic things. There was an encounter that my spellcaster had recently where I counterspelled at 5th level. I shut down the rival spellcaster that I was fighting, and I just annihilated them. I blew through a lot of spell slots to do so, but I felt really, really cool in that encounter, even though looking back, it was like, wow, you used a lot of spell slots. You used 3 spell slots on counter spells. And it was like, yeah, but that other spellcaster didn't get to do a thing, and I won the combat because of that.
I think as a general rule of thumb, you can usually suss out, once you've spent some time with your DM, about how many combat encounters you usually face. So for myself as a DM, I usually plan around 3 to 4 combat encounters in a typical game session or arc. Hey, I'm a 10th level character. I've got 2 5th level spell slots and 3 4th level spell slots. That means that I'm going to spread them out, and I'm going to use a 5th level slot once per encounter and never more than that. And then I'll use a 4th level slot if I have to, and then my 3rd and 2nd level slots are there to be used. It's one of those things where I see players get very top heavy sometimes. I see certain types of players will use all their high level slots, and then they'll have those 1st and 2nd level slots not used. And a 2nd level or 3rd level spell can have a big impact even at higher levels of play. So just assess it out and weigh how much you got to use, and use it at a measured pace rather than holding everything back.
Our next point is actually the exact contradiction of that point, but I think they can go hand in hand. And this is being overly wasteful with your resources. So although you want to use your resources, and don't be cagey about, oh, I shouldn't use any spell slots, let's just revert to cantrips, or I don't want to use my smites because I only have a few of them per day. But you pair that with the idea that you can also use these in terrible ways. If you're near the end of combat and there's 3 goblins left on the battlefield and you all get to go before they do, you don't need to drop a fireball. you can probably just use a cantrip now and let you and your friends clean up the mess.
We've all experienced the paladin going to town with Oath of Enmity and smiting on every single attack, dropping all of their abilities, and then having nothing left in the gas tank after that. That's a very epic turn, and to be fair, there is no kill like overkill.
But save it for the Demon Lord.
Yeah. You don't need to use it on the goblin. Save that for the Demon Lord. Spread it out. I think Paladin players are really susceptible to this. I feel like they just, it's like smite. I got to smite on every single attack.
Having played a Paladin up to 17th level, smiting's my favorite thing to do. It feels good to smite, but it's actually probably the lesson for a Paladin is pulling yourself back and be like, you don't have to smite on the Goblin.
Yeah.
Again, save it for the Demon Lord, save it for the Undead, save it for the Necromancer. Drop your smites when you're fighting the enemy that you're going to deal the most damage to. I like saving my smites for those places where I get that extra D8, or again, if I have my target priority. This spellcaster is concentrating on a spell that is wrecking the battlefield. Perfect time to drop a smite on them. You're going to force them to make a really tough concentration check. These are the times when it's good to smite. So know when to use your resources. Don't be cagey about using them, but don't use them in dumb ways that are going to be wasteful. Again, we love overkill, but overkill on the Demon Lord because you used your highest level smite, and then you had multi-attack, and you just used smite and vows and all of that. Perfect. You killed the Demon Lord in like 2 rounds. Love it.
Now, our next point, doesn't matter if you overuse them or underuse them, if you just forget entirely that they exist. And this comes into our next point of forgetting to use your crucial abilities. And this is particularly true for your more reactive abilities like reactions, rerolls, the lucky feats.
Or if you are a Shadow Sorcerer who has an ability that says that when you are reduced to 0 hit points, you actually get to like roll a die and get back up with 1 hit point.
Relentless Endurance for half-orcs. I think also Shadow Sorcerers have that feature, but I think you might have Death Ward as the spell that also does that. And there's also the Warlock Invocation with the book that Joe has on Wrath.
Yeah, there's so many little abilities that you can have. It might be an ability on your armor that negates crits. It might be an ability that you have that is a reactive ability to when somebody gets hit or somebody takes damage or a spell is cast.
Or remembering that you have resistance to fire damage.
Or remembering that you're immune to poison.
Yeah.
These are things... Listen, I know that it is difficult to keep track of everything on a character sheet. And again, we are 2 people who have made all of these mistakes. And even after we explain these mistakes to you, you're going to continue to watch me make these mistakes because knowing is half the battle. But that's not all the battle. The other half of the battle is me actually reading my character sheet. But sometimes you're caught up in the moment.
Yeah.
You're looking at the cool thing you're going to do, and you kind of forget about the other things that you could do.
I've gone through entire game sessions, my great shame. I've gone through entire game sessions with my Divination Wizard forgetting to use Portent.
Yeah, it happens.
And worse than that, which we'll get into a little bit more with the next one. I've forgotten to roll the dice at the beginning of the day too. So there's so many of these things. Or even characters, I've seen players that forgot that they had shield, forgot they had counterspell, forgot they had absorb elements. I've seen players forget that they had Featherfall when they needed it.
I forget as a rogue that I can take half damage on an attack once per round. I forget that all the time.
And I think it's very specifically like these niggly little abilities that are reactions or changes or resistances or things that modify dice rolls or saving throws in certain ways. Another one, I see players forget that they're in a paladin aura. I see players, and just a fundamental one, I see players forget that they have advantage or that they have disadvantage. Sometimes.
The other one that I think is really tough is you as a DM will often give us a boon, But a boon isn't like I write it in the notes of my character sheet.
Yeah.
And then I forget about the boon. Like it lasts, oh, it will last for the next 4 or 5 games. And 2 games later, I forget all about the boon.
And this is also, I think, brings us into our kind of another thing that players forget is forgetting to buff up before battle and assess like what your pre-game moves are. The classic example of this is the wizard forgetting to cast mage armor before battle.
I appreciate that Monty is a forgiving DM, and there are so many times that battle starts and we'll be like, could I have cast Bless before this? Or could I have summoned my familiar back? And usually you're like, yeah, that's fine, because realistically, we should have thought of that.
Inspiring Leader is another one that gets forgotten really commonly. And it also comes down to, just as you said, you can cast Bless before combat. You can also cast your summon spells before combat.
Yeah.
Because these usually last for an hour. So if you use those spells like Aid and Hero's Feast, if you want to use protection from poison or fire shield, these are all things that you want to do before battle even happens. And often in the excitement of the moment, I think a lot of players forget these kind of bookkeeping sort of moves, but they make a difference.
Even potions that have a pretty long span are often better than casting a spell. A potion of fly or a potion of invisibility, drink that before you go into the environment that you're going to be using it in.
And I think that potions are another one of the big ones of just forgetting to use your consumable items. Maybe I would also add forgetting to stock up on potions to this, but I remember recently when Joe opened up his bag of holding and was like, I have these potions. I have this wand of cure wounds. I have a scroll of dimension door and a scroll of chain lightning. And all of these things that would have been like, wow, that would have been useful.
Yeah, so these two go hand in hand as well.
Yeah.
It's forgetting to buff up, which is your spells, your abilities, your features, anything that you want to do before battle begins.
Yeah.
But then there's all of those items, and that's the other point, is there's all of these items that you have at your disposal. And I mean, you even brought up the other day, you gave us a scroll of Meteor Swarm, and then we went to war sieging a castle. I forgot that I had that scroll. But
That would have been useful at taking out the castle walls, wouldn't it?
well,
It's almost like your DM put it there for a reason.
I blame Joe for that one. He was the spellcaster in that regard.
Yeah.
So these are all elements of the players forgetting what they have at their disposal to use. But when combat does start, another thing that I think a lot of players forget about is the environment.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, I will say that if you're playing Baldur's Gate 3, Baldur's Gate 3 does an excellent job of showing you how important the environment can be. But just because you bypassed a trap doesn't mean that you can't use that trap to your benefit. Just because you don't want to cut the ropes on the bridge because you need to cross it doesn't mean that once you're across it, you can't cut the ropes on the bridge to make a bunch of enemies fall. Look at the environment, see what's there before you. Any hazard that was a problem for you is a hazard for your enemies as well.
Yeah, whether that's explosive barrels, areas of water, or my favorite, and another absolute great thing that Baldur's Gate 3 does really well is elevation. If you're higher up than your enemies and you have ranged attacks and they don't, you have a huge advantage over them. If there is a cliff that you can push somebody off of, Cazador.
I will say that out of all the things on this list, this is actually the one that I'm pretty proud of our group for.
Yeah.
I have seen at my table, Jill once, she played a barbarian, and she constantly was throwing people off of ledges, kicking people out of windows. She loved just using the environment. Joe feeds bad guys into traps all the time with telekinesis.
It's so good, and it makes your encounters more memorable. It is a great story. Using the environment makes D&D more fun, and it's effective. So do the thing that's both fun and effective. Interact with the environment. Be on the lookout. Even if you are just playing the bog standard human fighter, Joe is a masterclass in how you can be the bog standard sword and board human fighter and still have an absolute riot interacting with the world and using the world as a weapon against your foes. And that's not something that you should neglect.
If you find corrosive goo on the ground, you collect it in a vial and you throw it at a guard, and nothing bad can happen from that. Using the environment to your benefit, it's great and it's fun. And I think that, like, as a counterpoint to that, DMs throw a lot of environmental stuff in there. It's so much fun. And I think some of the most, like you said, the most memorable moments in a combat encounter are not when the fighter attacked again, or not when the rogue used sneak attack, or not when the spellcaster cast fireball. Those are all epic and cool. But they're not as cool as that time that the warlock picked somebody up and fed them into a sphere of annihilation.
Yeah. Cool stuff. So to sum up, the 10 mistakes that you want to watch out for when you are playing and fighting in combat in D&D. First, remember to work as a team.
Focus fire, but also target priority.
And at the same time, be sure that you're not spoiling anyone's AoE positioning.
Don't be overly conservative with your resources, but also don't waste your resources.
Don't forget your abilities, feats, and class features, especially ones that are reactions or things that modify a die roll. And at the same time, don't forget to buff up before battle, whether that's casting mage armor, rolling your portent dice, casting bless, summoning monsters or familiars. Make sure you do those before battle happens.
Also, don't forget all of the potions and consumables you have at your disposal. They might be jingling around in your bag. Just don't forget you have them and know when to use them. And lastly, don't forget about the environment. There's a lot of cool ways that you can interact with the environment and use your abilities in combination with the environmental hazards to defeat your foes.
If you take these 10 principles, your dungeon master is going to need to seriously up the challenge rating of the combat encounters that you're facing, because you're going to rock their world.
But also, if you're anything like us, you're going to know all of these now, and you're going to say, wow, I should really think about those. And you'll think about one or two of them at a time in combat, and probably forget the rest until the next combat encounter. But as long as you have a loose idea, you're going to do better as a team. And remember that teamwork is the fundamental thing that's going to make all of this work. So talk to the other players that you're about to set out on your adventures with, and make sure that you know what all of your capabilities are, what spells or abilities you're bringing to the table, and what your go-to strategies might be to really save the day and steer the battle in the right direction for you.
Now, of course, you might be able to make all of these mistakes in combat because your dungeon master is actually just making as many mistakes as you behind the screen. We're going to be talking about those mistakes in a future video.
If you have any other classic mistakes that you've made as a player for tactical combat, let us know about them in the comments below, or just let us know which of these mistakes is your folly. My answer is most of them.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters, who are really good about pointing out all the mistakes that we make in our campaigns on our patron-only Discord server. If you want to join our community, follow the links right down in the description below.
And if you want to see us making these mistakes constantly, please check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which is Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more videos about other types of mistakes that D&D players make, with the rules and much, much more right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time in the dungeon.